So now we're going to pick up where we left off on the last video, and we're going to start with an example of using this, figuring out how we wrapped to unwrap an equation with something that some people would consider to be a little complex. This is not where a lot of books would start in teaching you how to solve an equation. However, I think with this method, I think we can tackle it just fine. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to look at x and say, okay, x is essentially our pink sock. This is what we want to see, what we did to that pink sock. So if I use order of operations, I'm going to look at x and say, okay, if I start with x, what's the first thing I did to it? And by order of operations, that would be raising it to the second power. Then, after I raise this x to the second power, the second thing I would have to do by order of operations is multiply it by a 5. And finally, the last thing that I did is I subtracted a 7. Now then, when I was all done with that, I had a nice, neat boxed GIF that looks like a 38. Okay? Of course, with orange polka dots and blue ribbon on it. Now, the next thing is, okay, if we know how the present was wrapped, okay, now we need to figure out how to unwrap it. So, here's where the fun begins. Okay? So, putting the bow on it was the same as subtracting 7. And since now I'm taking the bow off, I'm unbowing it, that would be the same as adding 7. Then I would come to this wrapping paper piece where I multiplied by 5 to wrap it, but now I'm unwrapping it, so instead of doing that, I'm going to divide by 5. And of course the last piece, okay, the first thing we did here, we put it in the box, which was the same as squaring it. And so now instead of squaring it, I'm going to unsquare it, where we often call that a square root. So I'm just going to write the square root symbol here, and I'm going to put a 2 in to show that it's a square root. And that should tell me what x is. So let's follow that process and see what happens. So if I start with 38, and I add 7, I will get 45. And if I take 45 and divide it by 5, that will give me 9. And then if I take the square root of 9, that will give me 3. And notice at this point, this should be what my x is. So again, notice the process. I started with the 38. I started with the wrapped, bowed, boxed present here. And I followed the process to unwrap it by undoing everything I did to wrap it in the first place. So I took the 38 and I added it to 7. That gave me a 45. Then I took that 45 and I went to the next step of unwrapping and I divided by 5, which gave me a 9. And then I took that 9 into the last step where it says, okay, to take it out of the box I need to do a square root of 2, or square root of 9. The 2 represents the square root, and I will get 3, and that's what x is. And we can very easily check that. If x is a 3, 3 squared is 9, 9 times 5 is 45, 45 minus 7 is 38, and we can very easily confirm our answer. In the next video we'll do several more examples like this.